So, our last lecture of the semester, this class, is going to be a brief one, but it is going to be about transition. It's about transitioning into the present, how we got here, and what it means to have gotten here and where we go from here. And that's why we talk about, or that's why I've entitled it the strains of a maturing state. So it's going to talk about everything from race to economics to business and everything. I want to preface this by saying I'm not going to talk about everything that's detailed on every slide, just so you know. So as we go through this, you don't have to write everything down, and I'll tell you what to write down and what not to. I'll give you a warning in advance. But there's going to be a lot of information here that we do cover. I want to start by talking about civil rights in Oklahoma. We are covering things that take place after World War II. And when we talk about civil rights in Oklahoma, one of the things that a lot of people are surprised to discover about Oklahoma history is how Oklahoma is one of these sort of spearheading locations for civil rights, and it's for good reason. And one of the leading reasons is because of this individual, and that's Roscoe Dunjee. So Roscoe Dunjee was originally from Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. He was born and raised there. He moved to Oklahoma in 1892, and most famously published a black newspaper known as the Black Dispatch. The Black Dispatch began in 1915, which of course is just towards the end of the Progressive Era. Just so you have some, national context here of the time period. But keep in mind, when we talk about what this is like in Oklahoma, Dunjee is a black man living in a black town in Oklahoma. And he is someone who is living in a black town in Oklahoma that had just established Oklahoma Territory, and then it transitions into um, statehood, right? And he's there at the cusp of this time period where there had been hope that there could possibly be a black state. Um, there could possibly be all of these black towns were showing this all of this hope that black Americans had, that there could be the possibility of real black independence. And Dunjee is at the heart of this, right? Dunjee is a man who had established himself as a black economic leader. He had established a business for himself, and then he becomes a political leader through his economic independence and success. And so he starts to become someone who is a bit of a role model in his community, and then that influence expands and extends throughout black towns throughout Oklahoma. And so he gains a bit of a reputation. And so by the time he establishes the Black Dispatch, he had gained quite a bit of reputation. And he's one of these guys who is hoping that by the time statehood rolls around in 1906 and 1907, that there would be some real hope for, black political gains. As Oklahoma becomes a state. And then, of course, it all falls apart, right? Because the Democrats gain control of the territorial legislature and it all falls apart. And so, in the years since 1910, Black Oklahomans had essentially, disappeared from political activity, and Jim Crow laws had essentially separated them from mainstream Oklahoma life. You had the establishment of Langston University, which was the one black university in Oklahoma, but it was very much under the control of white political leaders. And therefore, they controlled all of the education. They controlled everything that Black students had access to, and that meant that Black students could only have access to certain kinds of subjects and certain kinds of majors. So there was no, for example, there was no law school, there was no medical school, which was, by the way, a preview of things to come, a clear violation of Jim Crow laws, and a clear violation of Plessy versus Ferguson, which established separate but equal. Um, because there was no law school available for Black students who wanted to be lawyers, right? Separate but equal means that you would provide a separate facility, and there was no separate facility because um, there were white political leaders who were fearful of educating Black people from being anything more than farmers or housekeepers. And so Langston was one of a handful of Black towns that were still standing. Um, the Black Dispatch, excuse me, was one of the most significant Black newspapers in the country, not just in Oklahoma, but in the country. It had 20,000 readers every single week, and it had passionate editorials, and these editorials demanded change. Demanded equality for Black people, demanded change in race relations. For example, one editorial demanded that Langston be treated and allowed to be run as a college. And because of this editorial, it got more funding, though it was not equal funding. Dungy was one of these guys who would purposely challenge the law. He refused to comply with Jim Crow laws. So, for example, he rode in the front of buses. He rode with white people on railroad cars in a direct violation of Jim Crow laws. He purposely rented out homes for Black citizens on the north side of a certain street because Alfalfa Bill specifically said that Black people weren't there. So Roscoe Dungy said, you know what? I think Black people are allowed there. So he would purposely rent out homes to Black people. He joined the NAACP. Which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He joined the NAACP in 1910, and he was an active member. It's not just the organization here based in Oklahoma. He became such an active member that he's one of its leaders. And so he in 1931 he would help create a statewide conference to help organize legal fights for Black Oklahomans, and he is the man that people credit for the idea. And this is where, again, Oklahomans are leading the way in civil rights, civil in the civil rights fight. Roscoe Dungy is credited for the idea of using lawsuits as a weapon in the fight for civil rights. So, for example, and I don't know if I've got it listed here, he connects with Thurgood Marshall. If you don't know who Thurgood Marshall is, I urge you to learn about who Thurgood Marshall is. You should know Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is pictured here. Let me circle it. Thurgood Marshall is this guy right here. He will be the first Black man to serve as a Supreme Court justice. He will also be the leading lawyer for the NAACP, particularly during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Thurgood Marshall is the man who will connect with Roscoe Dungy and start to use lawsuits to work with or to fight against Jim Crow legislation. And in fact, when we talk about these lawsuits, it's particularly important to consider what these lawsuits will do. So, for example, in 1935, there's Hollins v. Oklahoma, which will appear in front of the Supreme Court. Hollins v. Oklahoma will integrate Black people onto juries because before then, Blacks were not allowed to serve on juries. In 1915, literacy tests were made illegal because of Gwynn v. United States. Let me go back for a second. In Of course, the most one of the excuse me, one of the most um, famous cases of all of challenging Jim Crow segregation is Brown v. Board of Education in 1955. The thing is that what most people don't know about Brown v. Board of Education is at the heart and soul of Brown v. Board of Education is a case that appears in 1948, and that is Scipio versus the Oklahoma State Board of Regents. Scipio is actually Ada Lewis Scipio. Ada Lewis Scipio is this young woman here. Let me see if I can highlight her very quickly. Ada Lewis Scipio is this young woman here. Ada Lewis Scipio was actually a student at Langston University who had graduated with a 4.0 GPA. She had an older brother who was also very intelligent, and he had originally been recruited uh, to possibly be a part of this lawsuit to go into law school. But he had no interest in participating in the lawsuit. But Ada Lewis Scipio, who wanted to go to law school, did. She jumped into this opportunity. And Scipio um, had the grade point average. She had all of the capabilities of it. And when she applied to go into law school, she had everything that qualified her to do so, except the problem was is that there were laws on the books in Oklahoma that essentially said this. Not only was she prohibited as a Black student to go to school with white students, but teachers and administrators who allowed Black students in their classes and in their schools would be fined. They would have to pay a fine for allowing these students into their schools. Um, when we talk about this response, here's the thing. The president of OU at the time, when he receives Ada Lewis Scipio's application, first of all, Ada Lewis Scipio is no fool, and Thurgood Marshall does the same does the same thing. So they both know what's going on, what's going to happen. They both understand that this is probably going to be rejected from the very beginning. When we talk about her experience at OU and or trying to apply for this particular experience or um, uh, this particular law school, her whole argument is, I am qualified. Why can't I go? And what's interesting and what's ironic here is the president of the university, George Lynn Cross, replies to her and says, you are absolutely qualified, and I want you to be here. In fact, I have no reason to reject you except to say it's illegal for me to accept you. I can't do it. I literally cannot I cannot do it. You are more than qualified to be here. I just can't. I just can't. There is no, he basically says there is no academic reason to reject your application, but I can't do it. Oklahoma prohibits white and black students from attending class together. That's the law. And here's the thing, the law is not going to just fine me. The law makes it a misdemeanor, which is just below a felony, right? So it makes it a misdemeanor for me to admit you into the classroom. And not only that, but if one of my professors, one of my faculty members teaches you, then my faculty member is accused of committing a misdemeanor. So it's not just George Lynn Cross who's arrested and accused of being of committing a misdemeanor. The faculty member will also be accused of that. So it's really problematic. The case then, they file a lawsuit, which of course is filed against the Oklahoma State Board of Regents, because the State Board of Regents is what's in charge of the University of Oklahoma. The case is then, it's brought before the state legislature. It goes, not the state legislature, my apologies. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Oklahoma State Supreme Court, after hearing it from the lower courts, the Oklahoma Supreme Court says, we don't see the problem here. This is not a violation of the United States Constitution. Segregating white students and black students is a perfectly valid policy to have. So, of course, Fisher, Sibyl, and Thurgood Marshall file an appeal. The appeal goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in 1942 says, here's a problem. You are actually in violation of Plessy versus Ferguson. As disgusting as Plessy versus Ferguson is, in that it establishes separate but equal, the problem is you don't even establish a separate. You don't establish a separate place. You have nothing. So you need to establish a separate law school. And so at the very least, you have to give a different something. You have to provide something. So after the Supreme Court brings down its ruling, the Oklahoma legislature, rather than giving Ada Lewis Sibyl admission into the University of Oklahoma's law school, or even close the law school down altogether, what they do is they put together this makeshift last-minute law school. What they do is they create something called the Langston University School of Law. It was literally thrown together in 5 days, and they put it together in the state capitol's Senate rooms. They put together a couple of office rooms in this state capitol Senate, and they call that the Langston University's School of Law. And they said, "See, here we go. This is your new school of this is your new law school, and it's directly affiliated with Langston, and we'll accredit it and everything." And Ada Lewis Sibyl was like, "No, I'm not going to this. This is not a law school, and I'm not going to this. You guys put this together because you're wanting me to go here by myself rather than getting me into OU." And of course, she said that this is once again them not abiding by the ruling. This goes on and on and on. And of course, eventually, what she ended up doing is she ended up going to OU. And I mean, one of the things that she does is it takes 3 years, but she finally gets into the OU College of Law. That's the thing. It takes 3 years, but she ends up getting into OU for the most part, and she's welcomed by her white classmates. She was forced to sit in the back of the classroom there was essentially she had to sit in the very back, and then right in front of her there was an empty row of desks, an empty row of seats, and then her white classmates could sit in front of her. She had to sit by herself in the cafeteria or in the student union when she ate. But other than that, um, she could be there with others. One of the things that this does, though, is that it sets a precedent for Brown v. Board of Education. It gives Thurgood Marshall, who is the lead lawyer for Brown v. Board, it gives him the tools he needs and the preparation he needs for the larger case of segregation in public schools, about what it means to be segregated, what it means to be separate from white students, and all the implications thereof, and why all of that matters. Now, Ada Lewis Sibyl will eventually, during this whole process, she gets married, and she's living her own life. And in this process, she realizes, you know what? I'll practice law early on, but actually what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take this back to the classroom. And she becomes an educator instead of a full-time practicing lawyer. And that's where she begins to, that's where she decides to take her experience. And education is where she decides to bring about real change. And that's what leads us to Clara Luper. Clara Luper is just a trailblazer when it comes to the civil rights movement, particularly in Oklahoma. Clara Luper, as many people will, if you were to ask people what she is most famous for, Clara Luper is someone who leads her high school students, Douglas high school students, in a sit-in movement at Katz Drug Store in 1958. They are inspired by the death of Emmett Till. They are inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott and Martin Luther King Jr. They are at that time, an unofficial NAACP youth council, and they decide to become more active. And so she leads them to a protest. And just a couple of days after they participate in this sit-in at the Katz Drug Store in Oklahoma City, Katz, which is a national drugstore, decides to integrate all of their counters across the country because of Clara Luper and her students. But one of the things that I want you to know is that Luper is not just someone who protests at this one thing. She is organizing marches for years to come, and she does it throughout the state. So, for example, she goes down to Fort Sill to try and integrate a park that is primarily used for white servicemen and their families. And she leads what is known as the 100-mile march down to Fort Sill. And the march does fail, but it gains quite a bit of attention. She's not just doing that; she's also organizing for Black workers up in Tulsa. She's marching for who are not only not they are not promoted. They're not promoted to positions of leadership. And she's organizing, she's leading civil rights marches, and she's also organizing protests. Clara Luper is no ordinary woman, and she is one of these role models who sort of gains this reputation of just doing the Katz drugstore. And what people don't realize is she's one of these quiet civil rights leaders who does significantly more. She's also someone who does she writes this play about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. She participates in the 1963 March on Washington by taking her students there on a bus, so that they can be witnesses to this protest. So Clara Luper is right there, sort of on the front row, and And she's also participating as leaders there, as so many others are. Now, with that said, this is one of those places where I'm going to just sort of talk for a little bit and explain things, but you don't have to necessarily write all of these things down. I'm just going to talk about it and talk about how um, this may or may not matter to you. Okay. So when we talk about the economy, and I'm just going to pull up agriculture real quick, there are some things that have changed and developed over many, many years. And this is going to be something that I go over as quickly as possible, just so that you understand, because a lot of this is going to change and develop over the years. And one of the things that I want you to understand is after the Dust Bowl and the destruction of the Southern Plains, the government is going to get heavily involved, especially because of who's leading the government, and that's Franklin Roosevelt, right? So Franklin Roosevelt is going to call on research. He's going to call on scientists to start getting involved and taking on a series of larger roles in experimenting and looking into the roles of nature and the roles of the relationship of the farmer and the um, versus nature, as well as most especially soil, right? So government will conduct a series of experiments in terms of what is it that the government can do to secure farm prices while at the same time making sure that things like soil can be restored and that sort of thing. So um, there are a series of things that happen in the 1930s where you have researchers, specifically men and women who have worked with and studied soil in particular, who are put in charge of making sure that the soil is restored and that natural grasses start growing again, so that people can come back and live on the Southern Plains, and so that is all restored. Then you have the government starting to put things like production limits on major crops, and we've talked about that in the previous lecture. Now, initially, when we talk about these production limits, these are seen as, of course, forms of socialism. But here's the thing: by the 1950s, these programs that were initially criticized as socialism, farmers really like it. Farmers support it tremendously because they are being subsidized. Okay, they are being sponsored by the government. When we talk about how these farmers get by, particularly in the Southern Plains, most especially in Oklahoma and Texas, farmers are being paid by the government to produce only so much. And when that happens, that means that their lives are guaranteed, and that really helps them out, because when you live in places like Western Oklahoma and there is no rain or the soil just doesn't produce, but you have all this land and the land has to produce something, and the economy relies on the land, this, knowing that the government is there to help you out, is incredibly important, and it is incredibly it's something that is incredibly helpful, right? Now, here's the thing: fewer people are making a living as farmers, right? Each year, less of the state's total income is coming from farming. In 1950, 1 in 5 Oklahomans was a farmer. If you compare, I mean, like, we're talking about 14% of the state income at this point. By 1970, that number is going to decrease to 1 in 20. And that's, so we're talking about 6% of the state income. So even with government support, it's not like a whole people are running to become a farmer. Why is that? Because farming is hard work. That's the thing. The argument that, oh, farmers get government subsidies, and all these subsidies are sponsoring farmers. Look, yeah, if government subsidies made farming easy, then everybody would be a farmer. Government subsidies doesn't make farming any easier. That's the kicker. You've still got to produce stuff. And even with all of that production, you've got to be able to go out there and do the work. And doing the work is hard. It is relentless. And it's every day. And you've got to make sure that you know what you're doing. That's the kicker. And here's the thing. After the war, the war makes a huge difference, because between 1950 and 1960, 219,000 people left Oklahoma. This is the thing. Like, people make a big deal of Okies leaving Oklahoma because of the Dust Bowl. But the reality is that the war is what makes the huge impact. After the war, people are leaving Oklahoma because they want to go out of Oklahoma, find jobs, seek out new opportunities. They don't want to stay here. They want to try out new things. That's the kicker. So when we talk about the people who do stay behind, they're still not interested in being a farmer. These guys are wanting to work in the surrounding small towns, and these guys are working off of government pensions or state relief grants. And the farms that are left behind, they only have a few acres. They're not massive farms. Those who have hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy land, well, okay, those guys have done well, but there's not that many of them. Now, in terms of agriculture and specifically cowboys, there's one that is really worth mentioning. And these guys, this is definitely worth writing down. So when it comes to agriculture and the farmer, one of the things that what I want you to remember is farmers are going to be are heavily subsidized, but that doesn't mean that there are still a lot of farmers. There's a loss of farming numbers, and it's because people have lost interest in farming, and that's the problem. Now, when it comes to cowboys, the guy that's worth mentioning is James Hitch. So James K. Hitch settled in the panhandle of Oklahoma in 1884. And his goal was to graze longhorns. He dies in 1921. His son, Henry, would take over. He buys more land, gets more and better. He gets better cattle. Because he's got so much money and because he's bought so much more land, he's bought better cattle. The ranch survives the Dust Bowl. His son will take over after the war, after World War II. His son, HC is his name. HC starts digging or drilling deep irrigation wells. Irrigation, of course, with water. The water enabled the fields to become a secure and steady source for grains. And what happens with that is the family goes from being a grazing business for cattle to now a feedlot business. And now you have Hitch Enterprises, which has access to, well, at that point, 1,200 cattle. And with Hitch Enterprises, you have multiple things, right? So you have a cattle company. So they started off with 1,200 cattle. Now their feedlots hold up to 158,000 cattle. The cattle are bought from, smaller producers. Then on top of that, they have Hitch Farms. Then on top of that, they have a meat company. Then on top of that, they have their own credit corporation. Everything is underwritten by themselves. So they are their own little corporation there, right? Everything is funded by themselves. They have their own cattle, they have their own meat packing industry. Everything is on their own. They are doing incredibly well. So in other words, they've figured out how to sponsor and support themselves. Um, since then, with petroleum and with oil, these guys have learned some lessons, right? Well, it's gone up and down. So, with some help from the government, what they've done is the state's written some proration laws, which has assigned limits on crude oil pumping. That began in the 1930s and it continues on. Also, the federal government has put some really tight quotas on the amount of oil that can be imported from abroad. That's changed here and there. A part of the reason why that's changed is because people have demanded more access to oil. Now, here's a part of the problem with that. When we talk about energy production and all of that stuff in the 1970s, production and refining of oil and gas accounted for about 5% of the state's total employment and total income. And here's the thing: now in present day, when we talk about um, guys working on oil rigs and things like that, when the oil industry is doing really well, um, you'll notice that enrollment at the university drops because all these guys leave and go work on the oil rigs. When things aren't going well, they come back to school. Um, the problem is that oil runs out. And so, what happens when oil runs out? It's a question that's worth asking because it will run out. Now, the chief industry in Oklahoma, it's the government. It's working for the government. And here's the thing: it's been this way, it's been trending this way since World War II. And starting in the 1970s, one out of every $5 came from government paychecks. It continues on to this day. Of the state's 14 largest employers, 8 were government agencies. And here's the thing: higher education. Um, let me get into the how. You guys know the how. The how is started by Robert Kerr, right? Because of World War II. Now, when we talk about how it's sustained, um, 1950s and the 1970s Congress, the Oklahoma delegation in Congress um, is usually one of the smallest, right? But it carried a tremendous amount of influence because of Robert Kerr. So Robert Kerr had a nickname in the Senate, and the nickname was the uncrowned king of the United States Senate. So this was a guy who knew how to carry his own weight. So he had a position in the Senate, on the Senate Finance Committee, and he made sure that every tax bill that went through the Finance Committee, um, especially was especially kind to Oklahomans. And he was especially paying attention to Oklahomans that were in the oil business. So any kind of tax bill that dealt with oil or would have anything related to oil, he's going to be super kind to Oklahomans. He was also on the Senate subcommittee on rivers and harbors, which, of course, we've got some major rivers going in through Oklahoma. He would specifically and especially create public works projects designed for Oklahoma. That was incredibly important. Now, there's another guy that's important and especially significant for Oklahoma on this particular delegation. Um, his name is Mike Monroney, Monroney. Mike Monroney. He was also in the Senate. He was on the Senate Aviation Subcommittee. He is significant because he's the reason why Oklahoma City has a huge FAA center. He campaigned for Oklahoma City to get that FAA center. Here's the other thing. Uh, at their peak, at the peak of all of their influence, um, when we talk about all of the projects brought into Oklahoma, military bases, civilian agencies like the FAA, dam projects, any of the water projects, federal highways, Social Security, all of those programs. For every dollar sent to Washington as federal taxes, Oklahomans have received $1.22 back as federal checks. So we make money off of the federal government. That's the kicker. So Oklahoma makes money from the federal government, and we do quite well. Oh, there we go. I spelled his name for you. We make money off of the federal government, and um, it's part of the reason why we are quite protective of the the projects that are currently here, especially military bases, because it is that incredibly important to us. The other thing that I want to emphasize is this, um, that is the impact of higher education. So, everything post high school. So, higher education is almost entirely the responsibility of the state government, but it's not the state government's biggest responsibility. Okay. So, by the 1990s, most people who were enrolled at OU and OSU, um, there were more people enrolled at OU and OSU, just those two schools, than there were full time farmers in the entire state of Oklahoma. And I want you to consider that for a second. So there are more students at the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University than there were full time farmers. Now, Tulsa, which at one point considered itself the oil capital of the world, um, yet at the same time, Tulsa Junior College enrolled 5 times more students than refiner workers in the entire state. Tulsa Junior College. So there are more people in the 1990s who were interested in higher education. Now, right now, um, there are other factors to consider, right? Primarily because of the pandemic, there have been shifts in that and changes in that, and that's something to consider. In terms of government agencies and shifts like that, this is where most Oklahomans earn their personal income. This is equal to at least 4 times what people earned in farming or in oil. People are going to earn way more money working for the government than they are on as a farmer or as an oilman. Period. Now, this is where we're just going to we'll keep things brief. Okay. So if you have to go back and write things down, then go back and write things down. I'm going to be as brief as possible here, because a lot of this is context that you can get from your textbook. From the mid 1970s through the 80s, one of the things that you've got to keep in mind is, there is, you know, agricultural booms, like there's a meat shortage, so the meat shortage nationally gonna keeps beef prices high. So like cattlemen would um, breed their cattle, and they were able to sell their cattle at higher prices. The Soviet Union had severe crop failures, and that benefited Oklahoma. Of course, it benefited all American wheat farmers, but Oklahoma wheat farmers ended up selling their wheat at record high prices, and of course, they ended up gaining way more confidence in your history textbook, look up the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. This is incredibly important because the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 is going to have a huge, huge impact. And I don't know why I have that indented on my screen there. In fact, I will correct that here. This should be over here somewhere. But this has everything to do with oil. There were oil shortages. And so for Oklahomans, Oklahoma oilmen started to turn up oil wells and started drilling for new ones. And $12 a barrel went to $35 a barrel. You'd have old rigs pumping around the clock and trying to produce as much oil as they could. You'd have new wells that were dug deeper and deeper. Entire communities and industries were resurrected. So learn about the Arab-Israeli War. However, of course, that's not going to last forever, right? As always, for every boom, there's a bust. So in agriculture, meat prices started slipping. So ranchers immediately start rushing to sell cattle. And of course, that meant that prices started dropping drastically. So lower prices. There were grain sales from Soviet Union. Because and the other thing with the Soviet Union, one of the things that happened is the Soviet Union in the 1980s invaded Afghanistan, and so we suspended buying grain from them. Farmers started to miss their payments, started losing everything they had. Bankers started to repossess farmland and they sold it at auction. So, and then oil in 1984, crude prices slipped down to about $13 a barrel. Everything started falling apart. So remember, for every boom, there's a bust, and it's just cyclical because of the age-old lesson. People don't learn from history, right? Now, here's the kicker, and this is the thing. Compared to the rest of the country and how Oklahomans are, Oklahomans on average still earn less than citizens in most other states, right? And a lot of that, is when we talk about how we spend. When it comes to government spending, we don't really spend a whole lot. We're below average in nearly every category of public spending, like public services. When it comes to education, even now, where we don't pay for a whole lot of public services, whether it's for infrastructure, whether it's for public education at K through 12 or higher education. And a lot of that is because Oklahomans prefer low taxes. Oklahomans don't want to pay for it. Oklahomans prefer lower taxes, and politicians follow that model. The problem, though, with that is that when you don't want to pay taxes, then you get exactly what you pay for. And when you get exactly what you pay for, then you end up with a lot of good, qualified, really well-educated teachers who we have been paying for through our what little taxes we've been spending. And these guys take their degrees and they go to Texas, they go to Arkansas, they go out of state, and they teach there and get better pay, right? That's the thing. When we compare our taxes to other states, for example, from 1945 to 1970, there was a single increase in the general tax rate. It was 25 cents in the cost of a driver's license. So I mean, when we take that very seriously. Um, in 1960, we were 28th among the 50 states for tax effort. In 1971 and 1975, we were 50th. Um, so here's the problem. In 1960, only 4 states invested more money in elementary and secondary education. In 1976, 47 states spent more money. In 1975, Oklahoma had more colleges and more students in them than in 1968, but spending on higher education dropped by 10% during those 10 years. Even now, we are 49th in the country in terms of education. We are in the lowest 4 or lowest 3 when it comes to um, in terms of investment in terms of education. Um, this is the key. Oh, and I've put those statistics there. So this is the key when it comes to um, responses and why we respond this way. Um, Even with new taxes, well, yeah, I'm gonna skip all that because it's just not worth it. Because I really want to talk about political leadership and why that matters. So, um, and shift gears just a little bit because I think that's what matters here most of all. So, in terms of political leadership, I will say this: Oklahoma's always been on the cusp of trying new things. Like, for example, we've always had the willingness to try. Challenging the old ways a bit. And like, for example, um, in 1918, women women were granted the right to vote. This was in November of 1918. Women were granted the right to vote in Oklahoma. Um, the woman here on the far right is a woman named Lamar Looney, and that's her actual name. She was a widow who raised 5 children. In 1903, she campaigned across the territory on behalf of the Democratic Party, and she was doing that in the 1930s and 40s. And then she's elected to serve as county treasurer. In 1916, she serves as the county clerk, and that's before women are granted the right to vote in 1918. In 1923, just a few years after women are granted the right to vote, she was admitted to the bar, and then she eventually becomes the first woman elected to the state legislature. She becomes the first woman state senator. Um, and this is the thing: the woman on the left, in the sort of sepia colored um, picture, and in fact, I'll highlight her here. This woman right here. This is Alice Robertson. Alice Robertson was the first woman elected to Congress. She's elected in 1919. And here's the thing about her: she was elected just after women were granted the right to vote in Oklahoma. And she was elected despite the fact that she had campaigned against women's suffrage. She was, in fact, the vice president of the Women's Anti Suffrage Association. And yet she is the first woman to become a congresswoman from Oklahoma. This is a thing. We have really strange political leadership, and yet we have people who are willing to try and challenge the status quo in ways that are new and uh, ways that would surprise you. So, State Question 302 from 1942 was the state question that allowed Oklahoma women to serve in every state executive office, including governor. So put a pin in that. That was passed in 1942. And keep in mind, a state question is one that is presented to the people. The people vote on state questions. So the people voted and approved of this particular question. allowing Oklahoma women to serve in every state executive office. So a woman could run for and win the position of governor. Um, and so they served in the legislative assembly and county positions and did incredibly well. Um, this next individual, among Native peoples, Kelly Haney, I've met his daughter and had the privilege of, um, working with his daughter not so long ago, and she's an incredible person, and I'm glad to have met her, and I call her a friend. Kelly Haney is an incredibly talented person, a nationally recognized artist. Kelly Haney has a fascinating story. He is a Seminole Muskogee native person who uh, was at one point the principal chief of the Seminole Nation. He also um, was the state senator uh, and in 1987. And what's most fascinating about him is that he was state senator from a district that was predominantly white. The fact that he was able to be elected from a predominantly white district in the middle of the 1980s is phenomenal. Um, this nationally recognized artist was taken seriously as an indigenous man who would later then become principal chief of the Seminole Nation. Um, if you guys are familiar with the statue of the Native man who that is on on top of the Capitol building in downtown Oklahoma City, the Native man who's got the arrow pointing towards the sky, that is designed by Enoch Kelly Haney. That's him. And then, of course, there is the story of Carl Albert. Carl Albert was born in a very small town named Bug Tussle, Oklahoma, which was not only very tiny, but a very, very poor community. Um, this community had one school that did not go past the eighth grade. Um, he is the first person from his family to graduate from high school. He had to go to a separate town to go to high school. Um, he went on from his town to go to the University of Oklahoma, and he is the first person from Bug Tussle to graduate from college. He went to OU, won top honors, and um, the top honors included winning a Rhodes Scholarship. He became a Rhodes Scholar and went on to Oxford University and earned a law degree. So, can you imagine coming from Bug Tussle, Oklahoma, and going all the way to Oxford University and earning a law degree? So he came back to Oklahoma during the Great Depression and he's unemployed. So he goes all the way to Oxford, gets a law degree, comes back to Oklahoma during the Great Depression and doesn't have a job. So he goes out of state and then he's drafted by the Army as a private. He comes back as a lieutenant colonel and he decides to get into politics. He files for the Democratic primary for the 3rd District and wins. He wins in 1946 and just keeps going. His political career starts there and continues for 14 more elections. Um, he becomes the Democratic Party whip, and by 1962, he becomes the majority leader of the House of Representatives. In 1971, which is an interesting, very interesting time period. In 1971, he becomes Speaker of the House. And it's an interesting time because he is the Speaker of the House during the Nixon impeachment inquiry. So yeah, he's Speaker of the House when the House decides the when the House votes to impeach Richard Nixon, and he is the Speaker for 6 years. So that's some pretty big shoes that we have now. When it comes to how these two parties function during this time period and how they work. After World War II, Republicans rarely carried uh, the state for presidential or senatorial candidates. Um, when we talk about the influence of power and how things go, it's really the Democrats who carry the day. Truman won Oklahoma's electoral votes in 1948, but then he will be the last Democrat to do it for 16 years. Eisenhower's going to carry it uh, easily, and then Lyndon Johnson will take it back in 1964. And then that stops. Between 1952 and 1992, um, well, no. Well, even since then, Oklahoma is just a red, red, red state. You can predict it from now until the next 10 years, and Oklahoma is just going to be a very red state. Prior to this, um, during FDR times, Oklahoma is a very blue state. Um, when we talk about that, though, um, Lyndon Johnson just wins the 1964 election and or just wins Oklahoma during the 1964 election. So you've got to ask, why is it that the Republicans come back? They are the beneficiary of two big trends. Um, One, Democrats are considered more liberal, right, than Republicans, specifically their presidential candidates. And here's the thing, it's not that Democrats can't win the gubernatorial election, because they do. The governor right before Mary Fallon was a Democrat. That was Brad Henry. And he won handedly both of his elections. He won his first election and he was immediately reelected. So he won handedly. Um, so it's not that they don't win at the state level, it's just that at the national level, Democrats are considered far too liberal. And the thing is nationally, Democrats are trying to win more liberal constituencies, right? They're trying to win unions, they're trying to win racial minorities, that sort of thing. The the other thing that you've got to consider is this: the Republican Party has become the instrument of states that are have a growing number of metropolitan voters, right? That are predominantly white voters and that sort of thing. So, you have um, white voters who have white collar jobs, they own their own homes. So you have a lot of that in Oklahoma City now, and you have a lot of that in Edmond and in Norman, and that's kind of a big situation that's taken place here. Now that said, Oklahoma is a place with quite a bit of history when it comes to political tension, and this is a big source of entertainment for our resident our our resident political scientist, Dan Brown. Dr. Brown loves to talk to me about stories of corruption in Oklahoma politics. When it when it comes to um, when it comes to how Oklahoma politicians uh, go. And here's the thing: when it comes to political tensions, a lot of that is set in place thanks to the Oklahoma Constitution. Um, it's set to where the rural areas dominate um, how things go politically, even though these rural areas dominate politics. This is the thing, they dominate state politics because initially that's where most of the population was. In 1906 and 1907, most people lived in rural areas. But now the twist is most of those places are empty or dying because people have left. They've moved to the metro area. They've moved to Tulsa. They've moved to Norman. They are not in these small towns. And yet they still hold political power, right? Rural Oklahoma ran the legislature in 1906 and 1907, and they still run the legislature, right? Um, at the time of Oklahoma statehood, each member represented about the same amount of people. And to maintain equity, legislatures were supposed to adjust their own district lines with every subsequent federal census, beginning with 1910. In the next 5 census reports that came after that, they ignored that constitutional rule. So in the early 1960s, for example, nearly half of the state's population lived in or near Oklahoma County or Tulsa County. And what ends up happening is because they ignored that constitutional rule of adjusting your district line to make sure that you are representing the accurate population, what ends up happening is these guys are given way more power than they really should have. And these guys in rural areas, I mean. Meanwhile, the guys who are supposed to represent Oklahoma County and Tulsa counties, they are elected. They are only allowed to represent the same number of people that they were representing in 1907, which sucks, right? Because they have massive amounts of people. So that was really problematic. Here's the other thing. When we talk about how these tensions sort of overflow, these post-war governors, meaning after World War II, weren't great people. So I want to talk about what they look like. So immediately after the war, there is a Governor Roy Turner, who wanted to carry on the legacy of Robert Kerr. So he's in office from 1947 to 51. He continues Kerr's progress, which is great, but he doesn't confront any of the rural representatives who are completely out of control. Then there's from 1955 to 1959, there's a guy named Raymond Gary. He, started to integrate the public school system. But yet again, we have this allowance given to rural representatives and his rural allies because he liked them. So he allowed them to just, do whatever they wanted to do. And they were allowed to dominate state affairs. From 1951, oh, I skipped over this guy, I'm sorry. 1951 to 1954, there's a guy named Johnston Murray. That last name should sound familiar. It sounds familiar because he's the son of Alfalfa Bill Murray. So Alfalfa Bill Murray's son, Johnston, was so frustrated with the rural domination of the state legislature that he decided he was just going to leave. So he left the state, moved to Texas, and he joined the Republican Party. So he stopped being a Democrat and he joined the Republicans. Um, so then there is, um, there are all of these stories of other governors, and we won't get into that, but this series of issues that ends up going into lawsuits, right? So, rural domination doesn't end until federal judges get involved. In 1964, like the federal government, had to step in, and in 1964, federal judges stepped in and ordered Oklahoma's legislature to redraw Oklahoma's districts, both in the Senate and in the House, on a one man, one vote basis. So, in other words, we're not going to do this revisiting thing of going every 10 years and redrawing the lines. None of that. You're going to one man will have one vote, and that's how we're doing it. Because if we base it on the census, it's going to be chaos. Okay. So that leads me into this point, and that is the fact that Oklahoma's political drama was was bringing in national attention. The fact that the state legislature couldn't get its act together, so much so that federal judges had to get involved, um, was just the tip of the iceberg. So there was a Time article that came out about Oklahoma politics, and the title of the article was Aroma in Oklahoma. So, Aroma in Oklahoma is specifically about what's going on in Oklahoma politics from the 1970s into the 1980s. It's literally a study that that covers 10 years of Oklahoma politics. That's how bad it is, guys. 10 years of Oklahoma politics. Here's how bad it is. Between 1977 and 1987, 246 Oklahoma public officials were convicted of federal crimes, and there were far more who were convicted of state offenses. Oklahoma Congressman Victor Wickersham was named America's worst congressman because while he was in Congress, out of his office in Washington, D.C., he was also running his real estate business. What? Why are these people this way? Then there was another guy, Mickey Edwards, who who was arrested for a check writing scandal. That would be later in the 1990s. Then there was David Hall. This is a big one. So David Hall was a one-time governor of Oklahoma. He left office. He had to because he was accused of and found guilty of attempting to bribe the Oklahoma Secretary of State, and so he had to serve time in a federal prison. There were plenty of stories of state legislators who were convicted for drunken driving, convicted of narcotics trafficking, convicted of bribery, extortion. And it's not just legislators, guys. There are state judges who were dealing with bribery convictions, serving federal prison terms. The federal prison term actually happened to a state Supreme Court judge and two sitting justices. So, everything was great. There's corruption everywhere. Um, there's corruption from commissioners who took 10% kickbacks on everything that had been bought with state tax money. So yeah, this is really problematic in the 70s and 80s. And then that, and this is, I don't mean to imply anything here, but then it leads me to Mary Fallin. So Mary Fallin is a really interesting sort of person to end with. Mary Fallin was raised in a family of Democrats. Her parents were both Democrats and both involved in politics. Her father was a mayor, and during his term as mayor, he died. And when he died, her mother took over and served as mayor. And then she went to college. She went to OBU, Oklahoma Baptist University, and then transferred and went to Oklahoma State University. During her time in college, she became a Republican, and that's where she became more active in politics, or more interested in politics. Here's the thing that you should know about Mary Fallon, and again, this is whatever you think of Mary Fallon, this is regardless of that. This is nothing to do with political beliefs or anything like that. Mary Fallon has never, ever lost an election. She has never lost an election. So she's served at the state legislature. She has served as lieutenant governor. She was elected to be a congresswoman. She is only the second congresswoman. She was only the second woman elected to Congress from the state of Oklahoma. And then, of course, she became the first governor, first woman to be elected as governor of Oklahoma. Um, and in all of those attempts, here's the thing: what she made clear is she did it on her terms. She defined it in her way, to her credit, right? Um, when she ran for office, in one of the roles where she ran for office, she happened to be pregnant with her second child, with her son. And when she was pregnant, Republicans, the Republican leadership, Republican Party organizers told her to either drop out of the race or to get an abortion. Republicans told her that. And she did not. She went door to door and campaigned uh, pregnant. And she did it. She won her election. That's the thing. Um, so, regardless of whether or not you agree with her or disagree with her, there is something to be said about um, her tenacity. And there is something to be said about um, the fact that she was able to successfully campaign, and she was able to successfully make it. Now, what she was able to do, what she was able to accomplish, I think that's going to take some time before we can really decide on the kind of impact she had. Was she able to successfully um, negotiate with, uh, work with the state legislature? How did she compare to other governors and other governors of her time? And um, that sort of thing, that takes time. But when we talk about, or if we're talking about the context of political leadership or political uniqueness, there is something to be said of the fact that she was able to create and carve her own path. And I think in the narrative of Oklahoma history, that's literally the story of Oklahoma, that Oklahoma has always found its own way to create its own narrative, its own path. And that's really been the whole point the entire way.